The M4 Sherman was a machine of contradictions. When it first arrived on the battlefields of North Africa, first it represented the vast, first untapped industrial heart of a sleeping giant. But for the veteran German Panzer crews who faced it, ours hardened by years of mechanized warfare. Ours, this new American tank was a subject of derision. Ours, not fear. Ours, they watched from the 88mm sights of their Tigers, ours and the long-barreled cannons of their Panzer Fees, ours as these tall, ours clumsy-looking tanks rolled toward them. Ours and they laughed. The laughter was born of confidence, raw, a supreme arrogance forged in the crucible of lightning victories. Thus, these German crews were the masters of armored warfare. Yes, they had seen the M4's predecessors, masters the M3 Lee and Grant, Passon, and found them wanting. Now, pass her this new vehicle, pass her the Sherman, Rasher seemed to repeat the same flawed American philosophies. Yes, it was high, Rash offering a generous target. Yes, its armor was flat, Rash almost vertical in places. Rasho, a seemingly naive design flaw that invited penetration. Its main armament, a short 75mm gun, was adequate for infantry support, but it was a pea shooter against the thick, sloped hides of their own beasts of prey. In this brutal, unforgiving war, our perception was reality. And the reality was that a tank was only as good as its ability to kill, and its ability to survive. Our battles were won by a combination of steel, our firepower, and the iron will of the men sealed inside. Now, let us return to the dust of the battlefield. Ace. The German crews had every reason for their dismissal. Ace, by 1943, they were operating some of the most lethally effective armored vehicles ever created. Ace, the Tiger WWII, reintroduced in 1942, was a 54-ton fortress. Its frontal armor was 100 millimeters thick. A wall of steel, impervious to almost every Allied anti-tank gun then in service. Its cannon, the legendary 8.8 centimeter KWK-36. Was a direct descendant of the fearsome anti-aircraft gun. It could kill a Sherman from 2,000 yards away, long before the American tank could even get in range to reply. A direct hit from an 88 WWII was not a penetration. It was an event. The high explosive shell would punch through the M4's thin plate and detonate inside, turning the crew compartment into a white-hot abattoir. Then there was the Panzer Fee, Mirn the Panther. It arrived in 1943 as a direct answer to the Soviet T-34. The Panther possessed what many considered the perfect balance of firepower, mobility, and armor. Its 7.5 semi-KWK-42 gun, had a much higher velocity than the Tiger's 88. And its sloping frontal armor was so effective, that it could deflect shells that would have crippled a Tiger. Against these apex predators, the Sherman was hopelessly outclassed. The American crews knew it. The British crews, who received the M4 in vast numbers through Lend-Lease, knew it. And the Germans, most of all, knew it. German tank aces, men like Michael Wittmann, became legends by exploiting this technological gap. They spoke of the American tank with contempt. In their after-action reports and personal diaries, the M4 was a Tommy Cooker, or a Ronson, after the cigarette lighter's slogan, or lights first time, air every time. This grim nickname was a testament to the Sherman's propensity to burst into flames when hit. Its ammunition was stored in sponsons on the sides of the hull, raw unprotected. A penetrating shot, or even one that failed to hit anything vital, could ignite the propellant in the stored shells, roar, incinerating the crew in seconds. Ogs. The psychological effect on both sides was profound. Quar, for the Germans, it reinforced their sense of technological and martial superiority. Quar, they were knights in steel chargers, battling a tide of inferior machines. They developed tactics specifically to deal with the swarms of Shermans. A single Tiger or Panther would often hold a position, shoot the gallery, knocking out M4 after M4 as they advanced. The German gunners became meticulous, placing their shots with devastating precision. They aimed for the hull, the turret ring, the flat glacis plate. It hardly mattered. At the typical combat ranges in Normandy, almost any hit was fatal. This disparity bred a dangerous complacency. Panzer commanders felt secure, almost invincible. They believed the war in the West was a numbers game, and that their superior quality would always triumph over American quantity. They saw the M4 Sherman not as a weapon, but as a flaw in Allied thinking. They believed the Americans were trying to win the war with industry, not with warriors. They laughed at the crews who manned these rolling coffins, men they assumed must be terrified, second-rate soldiers. They did not yet understand the desperation farce that this very inferiority would breed. They did not know that in hidden workshops in England, a plan was forming. A plan to turn their laughter into silence. A plan to mount a gun so large and so powerful, into the Sherman's flawed chassis that it would change the very calculus of armored warfare. The laughter was loud in 1943 and early 1944. It would not last. To the men who had to fight in it, the M4 Sherman was a collection of lethal compromises. Its virtues were reliability and numbers. Its vices were matters of life and death. The most glaring of these, literally, was its height. The Sherman stood over 9 feet tall, a full 2 feet taller than the Soviet T-34 and significantly higher than the sleek German Panther. This was not a capricious design choice. It was the direct result of an engineering decision made years earlier. The tank was built around a radial aircraft engine, a bulky 9-cylinder power plant that, when mounted in a hull, necessitated a tall profile to accommodate the high-mounted crankshaft. This, in turn, required a long drive shaft running to the transmission in the front, further raising the crew compartment and the turret ring. In the open country of North Africa, this height was a disadvantage. In the Bocage of Normandy, it was a death sentence. The Bocage was a landscape of small sunken lanes and ancient towering hedgerows. These earthen mounds, tangled with roots and trees, were impenetrable barriers. For a Sherman to advance, it often had to heave itself up and over these embankments. As it did, its high profile meant its thin underbelly or its tall sides were exposed to the enemy guns waiting in ambush. The German anti-tank gunner or the hidden Panzer crew would wait for that moment, the moment the Sherman crested the bank, silhouetted against the sky. It was a target that was impossible to miss. But the flaw that truly terrified its crews was fire. The nickname Ronson was not a joke. It was a bitter gallows humor acknowledgment of a fatal design flaw. Early Shermans stored their 75mm ammunition in sponsons, which were projections on the side of the hull. These racks of shells were dry, meaning they were simply held in place, lining the crew compartment. Worse, the armor on the Sherman side was thin, only 38mm, and completely vertical. It offered no ballistic advantage. A German shell, even from a long-range Panzer IV, could easily punch through this plate. The result was cataclysmic. When a shell penetrated the sponson, it would strike the stored ammunition. The propellant in the shell casings would instantly deflagrate, turning the entire interior of the tank into a pressurized furnace. The conflagration, reaching thousands of degrees, would consume the crew in seconds. Men who survived a hit often did so by bailing out, on fire, only to die in agony on the battlefield. This single terrible flaw overshadowed all the Sherman's other qualities. It created a deep, abiding psychological terror in its crews. Every time they buttoned the hatch, they did so with the knowledge that they were sitting inside a potential tinderbox. This fear was compounded by the Sherman's main gun, the 75mm M3. As an infantry support weapon, it was excellent. It fired a large, effective, high-explosive shell that could demolish machine gun nests and enemy fortifications. But against the new generation of German heavy armor, it was tragically underpowered. The M3 was a low-velocity gun. Its standard armor-piercing round simply lacked the kinetic energy to defeat the frontal armor of a Tiger or a Panther at combat ranges. Allied tankers described the experience of firing at a Tiger as watching their shells bounce off like rubber balls. The rounds would ricochet, sparking harmlessly off the thick, sloped German steel. For a Sherman crew to have any hope of killing a Tiger, they had to be close. Dangerously close. They had to maneuver, to swarm, to try and get a shot into the Tiger's thinner side or rear armor. This was a suicidal proposition. The Tiger's 88mm gun could destroy them from a mile away. The Sherman had to close to within 500 yards. It was a duel between a rapier and a club, and the Sherman crew was holding the club. The Germans knew this. Their tactics evolved to exploit it. A Tiger or Panther crew would often allow Shermans to advance, holding their fire, confident in their invulnerability. They would wait until the range was optimal for their own guns, and then, with methodical precision, they would begin to destroy the American tanks, one by one. This technological chasm solidified the confidence of the German crews. They felt they were fighting with superior tools, backed by superior doctrine. The war in the West seemed to be a simple equation. One Tiger was worth 5, perhaps 10, Shermans. Allied planners tried to compensate with numbers, believing that attrition would favor their massive industrial output. But the men on the front lines paid for this strategic calculation in blood. The fear in the Allied tank parks was palpable. Crews became fatalistic. They loaded their tanks with sandbags, welded extra tracks to their hulls, did anything they could to add even a few millimeters of protection, though they knew it was largely futile against the German guns. This was the dark reality of one. Sherman warfare in 1944. The crews were brave, but they were not fools. They knew their machine was flawed. They knew the Germans were laughing. And they knew that unless something changed, they were all going to die. The fields of Normandy became a graveyard for British and Commonwealth armor. As the invasion forces pushed inland, they ran headlong into the elite German SS Panzer divisions, equipped with the very Panthers and Tigers that had so terrified the Americans in Italy and the Soviets in the East. For the British, who relied just as heavily on the M4 Sherman, the reality was a daily slaughter. Their own tank designs, the Cromwell and the Churchill, had their virtues, but they too were armed with guns incapable of dealing with the German menagerie. The Churchill, a heavy infantry tank, could absorb astonishing punishment, but its 6-pounder or 75mm gun was useless against a Panther's glasses. The Cromwell was fast, but its armor was thin, and its gun no better. The backbone of the British armored force was the American-supplied Sherman, and it was failing. Every day, reports streamed back to headquarters painting a grim picture. Veteran crews, men who had chased Rommel across Africa, were being obliterated. They were dying in flames, often without ever seeing the enemy that killed them. A hidden Panther, waiting in ambush in the dense bocage, could destroy an entire troop of Shermans in minutes. The psychological toll was immense. Tanker morale plummeted. Men began to refuse to serve in the M4. They called it a death trap. They knew that their commanders were sending them out to die, to buy time with their lives, hoping to swamp the superior German tanks with sheer numbers. But the British had a secret. It was not a tank. It was a gun. The Ordnance quick-firing 17-pounder. This weapon was, without exaggeration, the single best anti-tank gun of the entire war. Allied, or Axis. Developed by the Royal Ordnance, it was a masterpiece of ballistic engineering. It was a large, high-velocity 76.2 Mirror cannon, but that designation was misleading. It fired a shell with a propellant charge so massive that it achieved muzzle velocities the Germans could only dream of. The standard 17-pounder armor-piercing round could punch clean through the frontal armor of a Tiger I at over 1,000 yards. But its true innovation was a new secret type of ammunition, the armor-piercing, discarding sabot, or APDS. This was a revolution in kinetics. The round consisted of a heavy, dense tungsten carbide penetrator, much smaller in diameter than the gun's barrel, encased in a lightweight aluminum sabot, or shoe. When fired, the massive force of the 17-pounder propelled the entire assembly down the barrel. As it exited the muzzle, the sabot broke away, leaving the thin, hypervelocity tungsten dart to fly at the target. This small projectile, traveling at over 4,000 feet per second, concentrated an immense amount of kinetic energy into a single point. It could slice through the sloping frontal armor of a Panther. It was the Tiger Killer the Allies had been desperately praying for. There was only one problem. The 17-pounder was a towed artillery piece. It was enormous. Its breech was huge to accommodate the large shell, and its recoil was bone-jarring. It was designed to be dug in, camouflaged, and fired from a stable, grounded platform. It was never, ever intended to be put inside the turret of a medium tank. The very idea was considered preposterous. The official British attempt to create a tank for it, the A-30 Challenger, based on a lengthened Cromwell chassis, was a disaster. It was mechanically unreliable, poorly armored, and the project was bogged down in delays. It would not be ready for Normandy. The crisis in France deepened. The British were losing tanks at an unsustainable rate. Their entire invasion foothold was threatened by a few dozen superior German Panzers. The 17-pounder guns, towed into position, were effective, but they were defensive. They were static. They could be overrun. What the army needed was a mobile 17-pounder. They needed a tank killer that could move with the armored columns, that could hunt the hunters. The desperation was so great that conventional wisdom was thrown out. If the official design bureaus could not provide a solution, one would have to be improvised. This is where the story turns from one of industrial production to one of battlefield desperation and ingenious modification. Several brilliant, forward-thinking individuals, most notably Major George Brighty and Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge, looked at the two pieces of the puzzle. On one hand, a surplus of M4 Shermans, tanks with reliable engines and good chassis but a pathetic gun. On the other, a supply of 17-pounder cannons, weapons with unmatched power but no mobility. The solution was obvious, yet it seemed impossible. They would have to force the 17-pounder into the Sherman's turret. This was not a request. It was a demand, born of the fires that were consuming Britain's tank crews. The laughter of the Panzer crews was about to be answered, not by a committee, but by a blowtorch. The task was not one of design, it was one of brute force engineering. The problem was simple geometry and physics. The turret ring of the M4 Sherman was 69 inches in diameter. The breech of the 17-pounder, the heavy steel block that contained the shell's explosion, was enormous. Its recoil was so violent, traveling back over 40 inches, that it would smash into the back wall of any turret it was placed in. The official British tank designers had already declared it impossible without a completely new, wider turret. But the men on the ground, faced with the daily butchery of their comrades, did not have time for new designs. In workshops hidden from German reconnaissance, men like George Witheridge and his team at the Royal Armored Corps Depot began to solve the impossible. They had the tanks, and they had the guns. Their only tools were ingenuity and a welding torch. The first and most radical solution was to rotate the entire 17-pounder gun assembly 90 degrees onto its left side. This meant the loading mechanism, designed to be operated vertically, was now horizontal. It was a crude, desperate fix, but it was the breakthrough they needed. By turning the gun sideways, the widest parts of the breech mechanism would now be oriented up and down inside the turret, rather than side to side, buying them precious inches of space. This single change created a cascade of new problems. The gun's recoil system had to be completely redesigned. Massive, new, custom-built hydraulic cylinders were needed to absorb the hellacious kick of the gun, and they had to be squeezed into the already cramped space. The gun mantelet, the thick, curved slab of armor on the front of the turret where the barrel protruded, had to be completely recast. A new, thicker mantelet was designed, which also served to protect the vulnerable turret ring from a direct hit. Inside, the world of the tank crew was turned upside down. The standard Sherman had a crew of 5, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and co-driver, who also operated the hull's bow machine gun. In the Firefly, the co-driver and his machine gun were the first casualty. The position was deleted. The hole in the glacis plate where the machine gun once sat was welded over with thick armor plate. This space, once occupied by a man, was now filled with racks for the massive 17-pounder ammunition. The turret itself became a cramped, 3-man hell. The commander and gunner were squeezed together on the right side. On the left, the loader was given a task that bordered on the superhuman. The 17-pounder shells were long and heavy, weighing nearly 35 pounds apiece. The loader had to somehow wrestle a 30-inch-long projectile from its rack, pivot it in a space barely wide enough for his shoulders, and ram it into the sideways-mounted breech, all while the tank bucked and yawed across the battlefield. The commander would be screaming for a new shot, the smell of cordite and hot steel filling the air. It was a job that demanded immense strength and focus. But the most glaring problem was the recoil. Even with the new systems, the gun's breech still flew backwards with enough force to kill a man. It traveled so far back that it would have demolished the tank's main radio, which was traditionally mounted in the rear bustle of the turret. The solution was as pragmatic as it was distinctive. Engineers cut a large rectangular hole in the back of the turret bustle. They then welded a massive armored steel box onto the outside. This box now housed the radio, safely out of the path of the recoiling gun. This bustle box became the Firefly's most recognizable feature, second only to its long barrel. It also conveniently acted as a counterweight for the incredibly long and heavy new gun, helping to balance the turret and prevent the tank from nosing into the dirt. The tank was a hybrid, a monster of necessity. It was officially designated the Sherman VC, or IC, depending on the base model, but the crews gave it the name that stuck, the Firefly. It was unbalanced, cramped, and its rate of fire was slower than a standard Sherman's. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the gun. What mattered was that for the first time the Allies had a tank that could meet a Tiger or a Panther on equal terms. It was a tank killer, forged in secret, in a race against time. As the invasion fleet prepared to sail for Normandy, a small but precious number of these new Fireflies were loaded into the holds of transport ships, their existence unknown to the enemy. The German tank aces waiting in France were still laughing. They had no idea that the answer to their arrogance was already on the way. The Villers-Bocage was a perfect killing ground. The dense ancient hedgerows formed a maze of narrow corridors, and at every junction, German anti-tank guns and panzers waited. For the German tank aces, this was a hunt, not a battle. They were supremely confident. A Panther crew, dug into a well-concealed position, might watch a British or Canadian column advance for an hour, noting their positions, counting their numbers. They would see the familiar tall silhouettes of the M4 Shermans, and the crew would prepare for another easy day's work. The German commander would select his first target. The gunner would lay his sight, his optics, far superior to anything the Allies had, bringing the distant tank into sharp focus. He would wait. Then, the order. Feuer! The Panther would jolt as its high-velocity 75mm shell left the barrel. A second later, a flash of fire and a plume of black smoke would erupt from the lead Sherman. A Ronson had lit up, just as expected. The German crew would begin the rapid, methodical process of reloading, seeking their next target. But something different began to happen in the summer of 1944. As the Panther's gunner traversed his sight, he might have noticed one of the Shermans had a barrel that looked impossibly long. Before he could process this, a flash would come from that tank. Inside the Panther, the crew would not even hear the impact. They would only experience the result. A sub-caliber tungsten dart, traveling at supersonic speed, would strike the 80mm sloped glacis plate. The German armor, designed to defeat every Allied gun, was instantly overcome. The projectile would not penetrate, it would perforate. It would punch a small, neat hole in the armor, and then, having shed its sabot, the core would slam into the tank's interior. A white-hot jet of molten steel and spall would shotgun through the crew compartment, ripping through men, ammunition, and engine. The kinetic energy transfer was so violent it could tear the turret from its ring. For the German commander, one moment he was an invincible hunter. The next, His world was fire, shrapnel, and oblivion. The shock was profound. For the first time, German crews were dying without warning. Their after-action reports began to fill with confused, terrified accounts. They were being killed by Shermans. It was impossible. It defied the laws of physics as they understood them. They reported being hit from 800, 1,000, even 2,500 yards away. A Sherman's gun was not supposed to be able to do that. They began to suspect the Allies had developed a new secret weapon, but they could not identify it. It looked from a distance just like any other M4, save for that long, thin barrel, which was often camouflaged. This confusion cost them dearly. Tank aces, men who had destroyed over 100 Soviet and Allied tanks, suddenly found their luck had run out. On August 8, 1944, during Operation Total Eyes, the most famous German tank commander of the war, Michael Wittmann, was advancing in his Tiger tank. He was a national hero, the epitome of the invincible Panzer Ace. His crew was confident, secure in the 100 millimeters of steel armor that had turned aside countless enemy shells. That day, they advanced into an ambush. A troop of Shermans from the Northamptonshire Yeomanry, including at least one Firefly, waited for them. What happened next was a brutal, swift execution. The Firefly, commanded by Sergeant Gordon, opened fire. Its 17-pounder shell, aimed at the man whose name was a legend, struck Wittmann's Tiger. The shot penetrated the Tiger's thinner side armor, slicing into the ammunition storage. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The entire turret and upper hull of the 54-ton Tiger were blown clean off the chassis, landing several yards away. Michael Wittmann and his entire veteran crew were killed instantly. The most feared tank ace in the world had been eliminated, not by a specialized tank destroyer or a heavy bomber, but by a modified stopgap Sherman. The news of Wittmann's death and the manner of it sent a ripple of cold fear through the German armored corps. This was not an isolated incident. All across Normandy, tigers and panthers were being brewed up by these mysterious Shermans. The hunters had become the hunted. The psychological impact was devastating. The invincibility of their heavy tanks was a myth. The armor they had trusted their lives to was now just steel, and it could be broken. The laughter had stopped. In its place, a new, creeping dread began to take hold. Every Sherman was now a potential killer. Every long shadow in the Bocage could be hiding the one gun that could end them. The Germans were professional soldiers. The shock of being killed by a weapon that should not have existed was quickly replaced by cold, methodical analysis. Field reports, intelligence from captured prisoners, and frantic battlefield observations were pieced together. The enemy had a new weapon. It looked like a Sherman, but it was not a Sherman. It was, they determined, a priority threat. The word went out from the Panzer headquarters to every anti-tank crew, every tank commander, and every infantryman manning a Panzerschreck. A new order of battle was established. The tank with the long, thin barrel was to be destroyed on sight, above all others. This singular directive changed the face of armored warfare in Normandy. The hunter had officially become the hunted. German tank commanders, masters of their craft, issued new standing orders. Their superior Zeiss optics were no longer to be used to simply find the nearest target. They were to be used to identify. Gunners were trained to scan the lines of advancing Allied armor, ignoring the standard M4s that they had once so gleefully cooked. They were searching for the distinctive, impossibly long barrel of the 17-pounder and the telltale armored box welded to the back of the turret. When one was spotted, the entire German firing solution would shift. Every gun that could bear, from the 88s of the Tigers to the 75s of the Panthers, would converge on that single target. For the Allied crews, this was a terrifying new reality. The men who crewed the Fireflies, often the most veteran and skilled tankers in a troop, now found themselves marked for death. Their tank, their Tiger killer, was a magnet for enemy fire. They were in possession of the most powerful gun on the field, but it was a power that came at the cost of anonymity. To be seen was to be killed. A Firefly commander could not lead a charge. He could not expose his tank for more than a few seconds. His life and the lives of his crew now depended on a desperate, deadly game of concealment and survival. British and Commonwealth doctrine was rewritten on the fly, not in manuals, but in the whispered conversations of commanders before an attack. The Firefly, which conventional wisdom would place at the front of an assault, was now held back. It was hidden. As a troop of Shermans advanced, the Firefly would hang back, 100, 200, even 500 yards behind, finding a deep shadow, a cluster of trees, or the shell of a destroyed building. Its crew would wait, engine idling, their hearts pounding in the cramped steel confines. The standard 75mm Shermans, in a grim reversal of roles, now served as bait. They advanced, drawing the German Panzers from their concealed lairs. The German commander, confident in his Panther's superior armor, would see the advancing M4s. He would select his target, order his gunner to fire, and watch another Ronson ignite. And in that moment, he had revealed his position. From the rear, the Firefly commander, who had been watching the entire engagement through his binoculars, would give his order. "Gunner, traverse left. Panther in the tree line, 800 yards, fire!" The Firefly gunner, a man who had to be both quick and preternaturally calm, would lay his gun. He would fire. The 17-pounder's muzzle blast was immense. A blinding flash of white and yellow, followed by a cloud of smoke and dust. It was a beacon. The shot, a tungsten-cored APDS round, would fly true, striking the Panther and turning it into a burning wreck. But for the Firefly crew, there was no time for celebration. The shot had just announced their exact location to every other German in the sector. "Driver! Reverse! Now!" the commander would scream. The tank would lurch backward, disappearing into its own smoke, crashing through the underbrush, desperately trying to relocate before the inevitable storm of return fire. An angry, methodical barrage of high-explosive and armor-piercing shells saturated the position they had just vacated. The barrel itself was a dead giveaway. It was too long. It broke the tank's silhouette. Crews tried everything to disguise it. The most famous solution was to paint the last 3 or 4 feet of the barrel's underside with white or light sky blue paint. This countershading was a desperate optical illusion, an attempt to make the barrel appear shorter to a German gunner frantically scanning the horizon. Some crews would even weld a false, shorter barrel to their turret's rear, hoping to trick the enemy in a quick, snap engagement. This deadly cat-and-mouse game defined the rest of the campaign. The Firefly was the regiment's prized possession and its most vulnerable asset. It was the only tank that could truly save them, and it was the one tank the enemy wanted more than any other to destroy. The greatest weapon the Firefly possessed was not its 17-pounder cannon, it was the idea of the 17-pounder cannon. By the late summer of 1944, as the Allies broke out of Normandy and began the great race across France, the Firefly had achieved an almost mythical status in the minds of the German Panzer crews. It was a ghost, a bogeyman, a steel predator that haunted their every waking moment. The laughter that had once echoed inside their turrets was long gone, replaced by a strained, nerve-shredding silence. Every engagement was now a test of identification and a test of nerve. The change in German psychology was total. Where once a panzer commander saw a column of Shermans and saw a target-rich environment, he now saw a field of deadly unknowns. His confidence, built on the rock-solid certainty of his Tiger's or Panther's invulnerability, was shattered. Now he hesitated. That hesitation was the Firefly's most profound victory. As a line of M4s appeared on a ridge, the German commander, once eager to start the turkey shoot, was now frantically scanning with his binoculars. He was not looking for a target. He was looking for a threat. "Is that one?" he would demand of his gunner. "The third one on the left. Look at the barrel. Is it long? Do you see the muzzle brake?" The gunner, squinting through his superior optics, would be just as uncertain. The Firefly's crew, well aware of this, had painted the end of their barrel, or covered it in camouflage netting. From 1,000 yards, in the dust and smoke of battle, it was nearly impossible to be sure. This crucial delay, this split second of doubt, was all the Allies needed. While the German crew was debating, the Allied troop was deploying. The Firefly, already in its overwatch position, would have time to lay its gun. The first shot, the one that had once belonged to the Germans by right of their superior technology, now belonged to the British. This terror in the shadows spread far beyond the front lines. Captured German tankers spoke of it. Their diaries were filled with a new respect, a new fear of the humble Sherman. In their minds, every Sherman was now a potential Firefly. The British tactic of mixing only one Firefly into a troop of 4 standard Shermans was a stroke of psychological genius, though it was born of scarcity. To the German gunner, every one of those 4 tanks had to be treated as if it held the 17-pounder, until it was proven otherwise, and often that proof was a high-explosive 75mm shell bouncing harmlessly off his glacis plate. But by then, it was too late. The real Firefly, the one he hadn't identified, had just fired its own APDS round. The very reputation of the Firefly began to do the work of the gun itself. German anti-tank gun crews, the stubborn, brave men manning the Pak-40s, were also infected with this fear. They, too, were under orders to eliminate the Firefly first. But this meant they often held their fire against the advancing 75mm Shermans, waiting for the priority target that might not even be there. This allowed the standard M4s, the ones the Germans had once dismissed as cattle, to get closer. They could get within range to use their high-explosive shells to douse the gun pits with their coaxial machine guns. The German anti-tank screens, once impenetrable, began to crack under the weight of this psychological pressure. Even the mighty King Tiger, the 68-ton monster that entered the war in 1944, was not immune. Its crews, the most elite in the Wehrmacht, were briefed on this single, terrifying threat. Their new tank was designed to be impervious to all Allied guns, save one. The The Firefly's 17-pounder, firing its sabot rounds, was the only weapon on the European battlefield that could reliably defeat their sloped 150mm frontal armor at combat ranges. The crews of the most powerful tank in the world were, in effect, told to run from a modified Sherman. This fact alone was a devastating blow to the morale and arrogance that had defined the Panzer Corps. The laughter had been silenced, replaced by a deep-seated paranoia. The Firefly was no longer just a tank. It was a potent psychological weapon. It proved that a weapon's value was not just measured in the armor it penetrated, but in the confidence it shattered. The British had taken a flawed, inferior machine, the symbol of Allied desperation, and turned it into the very thing that German commanders now feared most. They had taken the Ronson and given it a dragon's fire-breathing soul. And in the twilight battles of the war, German crews would often surrender rather than face what they believed was a troop of fireflies, even when none were present. The shadow of the gun was now as powerful as the gun itself. The legacy of a weapon is not always found in its production numbers or its final kill-to-loss ratio. It is found in the silence it creates. The M4 Sherman Firefly was, by every objective measure, a deeply flawed tank. It was a compromise, an improvisation, a stopgap solution born of sheer desperation. It was cramped, unbalanced, and its slower rate of fire made it vulnerable. Its thin armor was no different from the Ronson it was based on, and its muzzle flash was so large it gave away its position to every gunner within a mile. But none of that mattered. The Firefly's true purpose was not to be a perfect tank. Its purpose was to stop the laughter. And in this, it was a spectacular success. The German Panzer Corps had built its identity on a foundation of technological arrogance. They were the new knights. Their panzers, the invincible chargers of a new order. The Tiger, the Panther. These were not just machines. They were symbols of a martial and engineering superiority that in their minds made them masters of the battlefield. The M4 Sherman had been the proof of that superiority. It was the wheezing, flammable, undergunned embodiment of their enemy's weakness. The Firefly shattered that entire belief system. It was a profound psychological blow from which the Panzers would never recover. The silence that descended upon the German tank crews was more than just the absence of laughter. It was the presence of doubt. It was the end of the arrogant, headlong charge. German tank tactics in 1945 bore no resemblance to the confident aggression of 1943. Engagements became cautious, defensive affairs. Every encounter was now poisoned by the possibility that the 17-pounder was present. This strategic paralysis was the Firefly's greatest victory. It effectively neutralized the qualitative edge of the German heavy tanks, not by being a better tank, but by being a better killer. The German war machine, which had always relied on its wonder weapons to offset its numerical inferiority, was now being beaten at its own game by a hybrid. This shift validated a different kind of warfare. The Germans had pursued perfection, over-engineering monstrously complex and resource-heavy tanks like the King Tiger. They were masterpieces of design, but they were few in number and mechanically fragile. The British, with the Firefly, had proven the value of battlefield ingenuity. They demonstrated that a good enough solution, delivered now, was infinitely more valuable than a perfect solution delivered too late. The Firefly was not the product of a design bureau's long-term strategy. It was the product of welders, engineers, and officers who refused to accept the slaughter of their men. It was a triumph of adaptation over doctrine. This legacy echoed long after the war ended. The Firefly and its revolutionary 17-pounder had decisively proven that the future of anti-tank warfare lay not in heavier armor, but in higher velocity. The concept of the sabot round, the tungsten cord penetrator, became the foundation for all post-war tank gun development. The British Centurion tank, which emerged at the very end of the war, was in many ways the spiritual successor to the Firefly, a reliable chassis armed with a devastatingly accurate high-velocity gun. The era of the heavy tank, defined by its thick armor, was over. The era of the main battle tank, defined by its gun, had begun. For the men who crewed the standard Shermans, the Firefly was their guardian angel. It was the big stick in their troop. They knew their job was to draw fire, to be the bait, and they did it willingly because they knew, somewhere behind them, their big brother was watching, ready to kill the monsters they could not. It gave them a fighting chance, and in a war of attrition, a fighting chance is everything. It transformed the M4 Sherman from a symbol of certain death to a symbol of combined arms victory. The laughter had stopped, for good. The German Panzer crews, once the hunters, ended the war as the hunted, peering from their bunkers and hidden positions, not for targets, but for the long, thin barrel that had stolen their invincibility. The Sherman Firefly's dominance was not a victory of steel, for its armor remained thin. It was a victory of ingenuity, a battlefield improvisation that broke an empire's arrogance. It proved that the will of determined soldiers, armed with a tool forged in desperation, could shatter the myth of invincibility and turn the tide of armored warfare. It was not the perfect tank, but it was the perfect solution. And that is why these tales must be told.